In 2014, Vladimir Putin did something he believed was permanent. He took Crimea, he absorbed it into Russia, he drew a line and dared the world to cross it, and then he leaned back and made a calculation that he was almost completely certain about. Ukraine would never get it back. It couldn't. It was too weak, too small, too outgunned. Crimea, in Putin's mind, was over, done, settled forever. That calculation is now falling apart, piece by piece, strike by strike, drone by drone. In the span of just a few days at the end of April and the beginning of May 2026, Ukraine did something that the Kremlin has spent 12 years insisting was impossible. It reached into occupied Crimea and hit targets so sensitive, so carefully hidden, so deeply embedded in Russian defensive infrastructure that their very existence was supposed to be a secret Iskander missile base buried under concrete and soil. The guard boats protecting the Kerch Bridge, the lifeline connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. Radar stations, air defense systems, all of it struck with precision in a campaign that is not random and is not opportunistic. This is a strategy, a deliberate, patient, brilliantly constructed strategy for forcing Russia out of Crimea without firing a single bullet from a Ukrainian soldier's rifle. And by the time this is over, you will understand exactly how Ukraine plans to take back the peninsula that Putin swore he would keep forever, and why the strikes in late April are not a dramatic escalation. They are the latest chapter in a plan that has been building for years. Stay with me. This is the story that Putin does not want told. Let's start with the strike that should not have been possible. April 28, 2026, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, the SSO, posted a message to Telegram that on first reading sounds almost matter-of-fact. They announced that overnight drones from their middle strike units had hit the storage location of Iskander operational tactical missile systems. The site was described as a hidden facility on the territory of a former missile base near the village of Ovashki, approximately 40 kilometers east of occupied Simferopol. Read that again slowly. Ukraine hit a hidden facility, a secret base, one that Ukraine was not even supposed to know existed. Here is what that base actually was. During the Soviet era, a network of reinforced shelters was constructed across Crimea for the purpose of storing Soviet R-5 medium-range ballistic missiles. These were Cold War installations built to survive nuclear war, built to be invisible to the enemy, built with the kind of engineering that assumes the people using them will need to weather the absolute worst that a superpower adversary can throw at them. The bunkers are buried underground. They are protected by concrete walls up to 60 centimeters thick. That is nearly 2 feet of solid concrete and then covered with layers of soil on top of that. Russia had repurposed these Soviet-era fortresses to store its Iskander missiles. The location was classified. The existence of the facility was not publicly known. Russia believed this was the one thing Ukraine could not reach. Ukraine reached it on April 28th with drones. The weapon most likely used was the FP2. According to the new Voice of Ukraine, this is a middle-strike drone manufactured by Firepoint, the same Ukrainian company behind the Flamingo drone missile hybrid system. The FP2 is built specifically for penetrating hardened targets. Its current warhead weighs 105 kilojoules, which is 231 lb. That is enough explosive power to punch through concrete bunkers of the kind Russia was using to protect its Iskanders in Crimea. And Firepoint has already announced plans to upgrade the FP2 with a 150-kilo warhead in the near future. Putin should note that what hit his secret base on April 28th was not even the final version of the weapon. The next iteration will hit harder. Now let's make sure we understand what Russia just lost, because the significance of Iskander missiles being destroyed is not just about the physical hardware. It is about what those missiles represent in the broader architecture of Putin's war. The Iskander ballistic missile has a range of up to 500 kilometers. That is 311 mm stored in Crimea. That range covers an enormous portion of Ukraine's mainland: Kiev, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipro. All of it sits within range of Iskander missiles launched from the occupied peninsula. Russia has been using these missiles to terrorize Ukrainian cities throughout the war. They are not a fringe capability. They are a core element of how Russia projects power from Crimea. And the variants Russia has developed make the Iskander even more dangerous. There is a cluster munitions version that Russia has been firing into Ukrainian territory, since at least April 2025, designed to scatter submunitions across wide areas and maximize casualties among civilian populations. And then there is the version that gives the Iskander its deepest strategic significance. The Iskander-M can be fitted with a nuclear warhead. Let that sit for a moment. Russia has been storing in a secret underground bunker in occupied Crimea missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Whether or not actual nuclear warheads have ever been positioned there is a separate question. Most credible analysts believe they have not, but the capability itself is a form of implied threat. Every Iskander missile in Crimea is a reminder that Russia can escalate, that the threat of nuclear use is never fully off the table, that Ukraine should think carefully before it pushes too hard. That implied threat just took a significant hit. Ukraine found the secret base. Ukraine destroyed what was inside it, and Ukraine sent Russia a very clear message. Your hidden deterrent is not as hidden as you believed, and it is not as safe as you believed. But Ukraine did not stop there. Not even close. On May 2nd, just 4 days after the Ovari strike, Ukraine launched a follow-up attack specifically targeting Russia's Iskander capabilities in Crimea. Ukraine's defense forces struck an entire tactical group of Iskander missile systems in an overnight operation along with several radar installations on the peninsula. United 24 media confirmed the details. 2 strikes in 5 days, both targeting Iskander systems, both hitting Crimea. This is not coincidence. This is not opportunism. This is a methodical campaign to strip Crimea of its offensive missile capability, to take the peninsula from being a launch pad for Russian strikes against Ukrainian cities, and turn it into something that Russia can no longer use as a weapon. If Putin cannot launch his Iskanders from Crimea, what does Crimea give him? The question that must be running through the Kremlin right now is exactly that, and Ukraine is making sure that the answer keeps getting smaller. Before we go further, if you are finding this valuable, this is State News. We track what is actually happening in this war and explain what it means. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is far from over. Now let's talk about the Kerch Bridge, because what Ukraine did on April 30th is connected to everything we just discussed. And once you understand the connection, the entire Crimea strategy snaps into focus. On the night of April 30th, Ukraine's Navy posted a telegram announcement confirming that it had struck Russian vessels in the Kerch Strait area, the body of water that separates occupied Crimea from the Russian mainland. 2 specific vessels were hit. The first was a patrol boat belonging to the FSB, Russia's domestic intelligence and security agency, which operates a guard fleet specifically tasked with protecting the Kerch Bridge. The second was an anti-sabotage boat called the Grecian Knock, whose entire purpose is to intercept and neutralize waterborne threats to the bridge. Ukraine's Navy confirmed that both vessels suffered what it described as irreparable and sanitary losses, meaning the boats were destroyed and there were casualties among the crews. Now, a patrol boat and an anti-sabotage vessel are not the bridge itself. Russia will be quick to point that out, and that is exactly the wrong way to think about what just happened. Ukraine was not trying to destroy the Kerch Bridge on April 30th. Ukraine was doing something more surgical. It was removing the protection around the Kerch Bridge, clearing the perimeter, taking out the defensive layer that Russia has positioned to prevent exactly the kind of maritime drone attacks that Ukraine has been perfecting throughout this war. Think of it this way. Before you can hit the target, you remove the guards. April 30th was about removing the guards, and this matters enormously because of what Ukraine is now capable of sending toward that bridge. The CB maritime drone, one of Ukraine's most significant naval weapons of this war, received a major upgrade in October 2025. Its payload capacity now stands at 2,000 talor-kili. That is over 4,400 lbu of explosive. For reference, back in June 2025, Ukraine used over 1,000 kilograms of TNT to mine the supports of the Kerch Bridge in an attack that caused structural damage. The CB can now carry twice that payload. With the guard boats gone, with the defensive perimeter degraded, the path to the Kerch Bridge is more open than it has ever been. Putin built the Kerch Bridge as a monument to his own power, a physical symbol of Crimea's permanent incorporation into Russia, 12 dollar miles across the Kerch Strait, connecting the peninsula to the Russian mainland. It opened in 2018, and Putin personally drove across it in a truck to mark the occasion. It was a statement This is Russia's. This is permanent. This will stand. Ukraine has been telling Putin with every strike in the strait and every mine placed under those supports that nothing is as permanent as he believes. But here is the thing about the Kerch Bridge that most people get wrong. And understanding the real reason it matters is the key to understanding Ukraine's entire Crimea strategy. Most people assume the Kerch Bridge is primarily a military asset, a logistics route for Russia to move troops and equipment into Crimea and then out to the front lines. And yes, that was the original plan. That was what Putin envisioned when he built it. Troops, tanks, supplies, all flowing across that bridge, keeping Crimea connected to the Russian war machine. That plan failed years ago. By May 2024, Russia had already stopped using the Kerch Bridge to supply its frontline forces. Ukraine's consistent pressure on Crimean supply routes had made it too unreliable, too exposed, too dangerous for large-scale military logistics. The bridge stopped being a military artery, but it did not stop being vital to Putin's control of Crimea. Because now, and this is the part that changes everything, the Kerch Bridge is a lifeline for people, specifically for Russian civilians. Since Putin illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, up to 800,000 Russian citizens had relocated to the peninsula by December 2023, according to the Kyiv Independent. These were people who moved there with the encouragement of the Russian government, which offered preferential mortgage lending and other incentives to boost the Russian population on the peninsula. As those Russian settlers arrived, the Ukrainian population was simultaneously pushed out. There were only around 100,000 Ukrainians remaining in Crimea by the time that report was published. The demographic engineering was deliberate. Russia was Russifying Crimea, making it Russian not just on paper, but in population, in culture, in everyday life. All of that Russification was built on one promise, Putin's promise of protection. Come to Crimea, Russia said. It is safe here. It is Russian territory. We will defend it. Live your lives. Ukraine is now systematically dismantling that promise. And the Kerch Bridge is where that dismantling becomes personal for every Russian civilian living on the peninsula. Here is how Ukraine's actual strategy for Crimea works. And pay attention, because this is not the strategy anyone expected. Ukraine is not going to storm Crimea. It is not going to send thousands of soldiers across the isthmus of Perekop, the 3-mile-wide strip of land connecting Crimea to Kherson. That strip is a choke point. Russian artillery and missiles would devastate any force trying to push through it. An amphibious assault across the Black Sea is equally out of reach. Ukraine has done extraordinary things with its naval capabilities in this war, but it does not have the fleet needed to land thousands of troops through the Black Sea under Russian fire. And crossing through the shallow lagoons of the Savash region to the north of the peninsula is theoretically possible, but carries its own enormous risks as a narrow approach that Russia could target relentlessly. Ukraine recognizes all of this, and so it chose a different path entirely, a path that is slower, quieter, and potentially more effective than any conventional military assault could ever be. The strategy has 3 interconnected phases, and Ukraine has been executing all 3 simultaneously. Phase 1 was the destruction of Russia's Black Sea fleet. This took years, and it required extraordinary ingenuity. Ukraine does not have a traditional navy capable of going toe-to-toe with Russian warships, so it built something new. Maritime drones, missile strikes, hit-and-run tactics. And over the first 2 years of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine systematically dismantled a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet. Ships were sunk or disabled. The fleet's headquarters in Sevastopol became too dangerous to use. Putin was forced to relocate what remained of his Black Sea fleet to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland. Far less strategically positioned, far less able to project power into the Black Sea, far less effective as a defensive shield for Crimea. The naval force that was supposed to make Crimea impenetrable was pulled back. Phase 1 delivered. The first layer of Crimea's protection was stripped away. Phase 2 is the sustained, escalating degradation of Crimea's military infrastructure. This is what we have been watching accelerate in 2026. Air defense systems targeted relentlessly. Barely a week passes without Ukraine announcing a strike against Crimean radar installations or surface-to-air missile batteries. Oil depots hit. Troop concentrations struck. And crucially, those Iskander missile systems, which were supposed to be the most protected assets on the peninsula, have now been found and attacked twice in 5 days. Every air defense system destroyed in Crimea does two things simultaneously. First, it opens an aerial corridor for Ukraine's drones to penetrate deeper into the peninsula, reaching targets that were previously protected by that air defense layer. Second, it signals to everyone living under that protection, Russian soldiers and Russian civilians alike, that the shield is getting thinner. April 29th, for example, saw Ukraine strike an MR-10 radar station, an air defense system, and a Crimean oil depot, all in a single night of operations. The pace is not slowing, it is accelerating. Phase 3 is the psychological campaign, and this is the most unconventional element of Ukraine's approach, the part that does not show up in weapons inventories or battle damage assessments, but may ultimately be the most decisive. Every strike Ukraine launches in Crimea carries a dual message. The first message is military and tactical. The second message is personal. It is addressed to the Russian civilians living on the peninsula. Ukraine is not targeting those civilians. President Zelensky is not Putin. Ukraine's military doctrine does not involve attacks on civilian populations. But what Ukraine is doing with deliberate consistency is striking the military assets and infrastructure that form the basis of Putin's promise of protection to those civilians. And every time Ukraine successfully destroys something that was supposed to be protecting Crimea, the message to Russian settlers on the peninsula becomes a little louder and a little clearer. Putin cannot keep his promise. You are not safe here, and it is going to get worse before it gets better. When that message becomes loud enough, people leave. They go back to the Russian mainland where Ukraine's strikes are less frequent. They take their families and they get out. And as they leave, the demographic engineering that Putin spent years constructing starts to unwind. Crimea becomes less Russian, not because Ukraine forced anyone out at gunpoint, but because Russia's own civilians made a rational choice about their own safety. That is why striking the guard boats around the Kerch Bridge on April 30th was so significant, not because of the military value of those two boats in isolation, but because of what it told the Russian civilians in Crimea about their options. The Kerch Bridge is how they leave. It is the physical route between the peninsula and the safety of the Russian mainland. And Ukraine just demonstrated with the destruction of the very boats tasked with protecting it that the bridge is within reach, that its defenses can be stripped, that the Sea Baby drones, now carrying 2,000 kilos payloads, now have fewer obstacles between them and those bridge supports. Every Russian civilian in Crimea saw that announcement. Every one of them understood the implication. Get out while the bridge still stands. Because if you wait too long, the route you were counting on may not be there when you need it. Ukraine is not forcing anyone to leave. Ukraine is giving people every possible reason to choose to leave on their own. That is a fundamentally different approach to liberation, and it is one that Putin has no clear answer for. He cannot shoot drones that have already been launched. He cannot unring the bell of a strike that has already happened. He cannot rebuild the air defenses Ukraine has already destroyed quickly enough to outpace Ukraine's next round of strikes. And every defensive asset Russia moves into Crimea to replace what Ukraine has destroyed is a defensive asset that is no longer available somewhere else. The front lines in Donetsk, the defense of Russian territory from long-range Ukrainian drones, the protection of the oil and energy infrastructure that funds the entire war. Putin is being forced to rob Peter to pay Paul across an increasingly long list of fronts. And Crimea is now one of the most demanding recipients of Russian defensive resources. Russia currently has around 32,500 soldiers stationed in Crimea, positioned to defend against exactly the kind of ground assault that Ukraine has no intention of attempting. Those troops are sitting in Crimea, guarding against an attack that is not coming, while Ukraine dismantles Crimea's defenses from the air and the sea without putting a single soldier at risk of being captured or killed in a ground offensive. Ukraine is winning this engagement, and Russia's soldiers in Crimea are standing watch over a threat that does not exist while the real threat moves against them, in forms that those soldiers cannot physically stop. This is the strategic genius of what Ukraine has built in Crimea. It forces Russia to commit resources to defend against the wrong kind of attack, while the actual attack unfolds in a domain, aerial and maritime, where Russia's ground forces are irrelevant. 32,000 soldiers cannot shoot down a drone swarm. 32,000 soldiers cannot stop a Sieve from crossing the Kerch Strait. 32,000 soldiers standing on the Isthmus of Perekop are not protecting the Iskander base at Ovashki from a drone that already found it and destroyed it. Russia has the wrong answer for the question Ukraine is asking. Let's bring all of this together because the picture it creates is more coherent and more remarkable than any individual strike might suggest. Ukraine began this campaign by destroying Russia's ability to project naval power from Crimea. A third of the Black Sea Fleet is gone. The rest has retreated. The sea around Crimea belongs to Ukraine now in ways it absolutely did not. In February 2022, Ukraine then turned to the systematic destruction of Crimea's air defense network, the shield that was supposed to protect everything else: radar stations, surface-to-air batteries, anti-drone systems. Struck repeatedly, relentlessly in a campaign that has created aerial corridors, Ukraine can now exploit for deeper and deeper strikes. Through those corridors, Ukraine found and destroyed a Cold War bunker full of Iskander missiles that Russia thought nobody knew about. Ukraine hit it with a drone carrying a warhead designed specifically to punch through concrete. And then Ukraine hit Russia's Iskander capabilities again 5 days later to make sure the message was received. Meanwhile, Ukraine cleared the guard boats from the Kerch Strait. It opened the maritime approach to the bridge. It positioned itself to threaten the one route that Russian civilians in Crimea can use to leave. And in doing so, it delivered a warning to every one of those civilians that the time to make a choice is now. This is not a collection of isolated strikes. This is a campaign with a beginning, a middle, and a planned ending. Ukraine is not attacking Crimea randomly. It is methodically dismantling every layer of the structure that allows Russia to hold the peninsula, the naval shield, the air defenses, the missile capabilities, the psychological promise of safety, and doing it in a sequence designed to make each step easier than the last. Where does this end? What is Ukraine ultimately betting on? Ukraine's long-term calculation for Crimea is a patient one. The plan does not require Ukraine to storm the peninsula at any point in the near future. What it requires is holding Russia off on the mainland, inflicting the kind of casualties and territorial losses that we have been watching accumulate throughout 2026 until the overall balance of the war shifts far enough that Russia is forced into a genuine withdrawal. When that withdrawal comes, if and when Russian forces begin pulling back from the mainland, Ukraine will be positioned to move on Crimea in a very different context than today's. By that point, the Iskander batteries may already be gone. The air defense network may already be gutted. The Russian civilian population may have already largely relocated. The Kerch Bridge may have been struck to the point of unreliability. And a Ukrainian ground force moving into Crimea would be moving into a peninsula that has been prepared for their arrival by years of systematic degradation. It may not even come to a ground offensive. If Russia's military position on the mainland collapses sufficiently, the forces in Crimea may find themselves cut off, unsupplied, and facing a choice between surrender and fighting on without support. Under those circumstances, the 32,000 troops that Russia has stationed in Crimea to repel an invasion become a liability rather than an asset, a large force that Russia cannot feed, cannot reinforce, and cannot extract easily without a functioning Kerch Bridge. Ukraine is playing a long game. It has been playing a long game since 2022, and the late April and early May strikes in Crimea are simply the latest moves in a game that Ukraine is, by every measurable indicator, winning. Putin told the world in 2014 that Crimea was settled, that the question was answered, that the peninsula was Russian, would always be Russian, and that anyone who thought otherwise was deluding themselves. He was wrong. He is being proved wrong, drone strike by drone strike, on a timeline that he did not anticipate and a method he has no adequate answer for. The secret Iskander base that Russia thought would never be found and destroyed. The guard boats protecting the Kerch Bridge eliminated. The air defenses that were supposed to make Crimea a fortress systematically dismantled over months of relentless strikes. The Black Sea Fleet that was supposed to make the peninsula unreachable.